celebration of difference with people from a range of faiths and beliefs. Thus, when Trevor kindly asked me to speak today and to say something about my own involvements, the theme of peace seemed very appropriate. What I didn't realise until I did some searching, however, is that for some Christian communities, today is actually known as Peace Sunday, presumably the Sunday closest to the 21st of September. So that seemed an even better link, until I discovered that for some Christians in the Catholic tradition, Peace Sunday actually takes place in January. And there is even a different World Day of Peace to which that's related. So maybe we even need some peace negotiations to try to find agreement on when Peace Sunday should actually take place in order that it's shared more widely. Maybe what we really need is a day of peace every day, a thought to which I'll return. In my own working life, I actually had the word peace as part of my title for 11 years, when I worked as Peace Education Officer for the Irish Council of Churches. And as an aside, I should add that my role in the Irish Council of Churches brought me close in a physical sense to All Souls, as my office at the top of number 48 Elmwood Avenue, just over there, looked straight out onto the ivy growing on the side of the church tower. That was my view for 11 years, and it was my long-term visual relationship with the church well before I ever stepped inside the building itself. And that room is still there, by the way. I glance up at it whenever I'm walking along Elmwood Avenue or heading into or out of All Souls. I imagine that for some people, my Peace Education Officer title must have sounded somewhat precious or even a bit pretentious, a sort of motherhood and apple pie kind of thing, sweetness and light. Maybe as though I was trying to suggest peace would inevitably follow in my wake, what some people today rather cynically describe as virtue signalling. This was in the 1980s and early 1990s, a time when in Britain, under the Thatcher government, peace education was being strongly critiqued, even ridiculed by some as left-wing propaganda. Thankfully here, I think we escaped most of that stereotyping, but nevertheless, I'm not sure that at that time most people had much of an idea what peace education, or maybe even peace, was all about. Though certainly in the midst of the troubles, we certainly longed for peace. Over the 14 years before I took on that role in the Council of Churches, I'd been a teacher, briefly in England and mostly here in Northern Ireland since the early 1970s. Living here through the Troubles, I became closely involved in the life and work of the Corrymeela community, and peace was a regular theme, including taking part in peace services in churches and in peace-focused musical events. So when someone came to the school where I was teaching, looking for people to help with a peace education project, I was keen to volunteer. The programme, ecumenically based in the Irish Council of Churches and also the Catholic Irish Commission for Justice and Peace, was developing and writing materials to be used in schools with different age groups, exploring peace themes such as developing good relations, appreciating the diversity of humankind, how to live with our differences, the power of symbols such as flags and religious emblems, and perhaps particularly critically in this part of the world, how to make sense of the diversity of churches and other religious groups. The voluntary role turned into an opportunity to do the job full-time, with funding supported by the Department of Education, and thus I came into my little office up top across the road which also for many years doubled as a Peace Education and Resources Centre. It was a wonderful opportunity to engage personally and professionally with some really important issues, and it was also a really steep learning curve. What I quickly discovered as I travelled around schools and teacher centres and other places where I was able to get a hearing, a little bit like a missionary, was that many teachers and others working in education just didn't see how this fitted in with what was normally done in the classroom. We had, I think, for the time, as part of that programme, some great resources, but there was very little sense in the system of how to make good use of them. Some teachers indeed were quite nervous of the reaction of parents or others in the local community. In one school, an initially enthusiastic head teacher was challenged by the school caretaker, who placed gospel tracts on the principal's desk and warned that he would tell a certain local clergyman what was going on. And so the resources that the school had acquired ended up unused in a storeroom. That's a true story, and it's not unique. Peace, it seemed, was not a good idea for everyone. For some, in fact, it was a negative word, about surrender, about compromise, about giving in or being dominated by the other side. It quickly became clear to me that what was needed was not just good teaching resources, but preparation and training in how to make effective use of any resources. A pointer, I think, to the rest of my career. Something that I learned a great deal about during those early years was how to make sense of the concept of peace in a positive way. We use the word very liberally and very frequently. We present the idea of peace normally, especially in our churches, as a very desirable thing. In Christianity, as in other religions, we're always talking about peace. Maybe as a greeting, peace be with you. Sharing a greeting of peace in the middle of a service sometimes. Making a prayer for peace for the needs of those around us. Maybe as a communion chant, Domino nobis pacem, grant us peace. As a farewell exhortation, go in peace. And indeed, rest in peace. We yearn for peace, as we did in the context of the Troubles. An end to violence and human suffering, an escape from oppression. And of course we hope for peace and quiet after a stressful and busy time, and we all need to do that at times. But in the Judeo-Christian tradition, peace is an altogether stronger concept. The Hebrew word translated in the Jewish scriptures as peace is shalom, used by many Christians as well as Jews as a greeting. Shalom means well-being and wholeness. It's often closely associated with justice, right relationships, you might say, in the community. Justice and peace have embraced, as Psalm 85 declares. It's an active concept, not just a state of calm. In the Christian New Testament scriptures, the Greek word for peace, eirene, adds the concepts of forgiveness and reconciliation, breaking down barriers, as in the Beatitudes when Jesus famously said, "How blessed are the peacemakers, those who work for peace." Peace is an active concept, a journey, a process, a way of being. Peace is, or perhaps should be, a verb. It's something that we do. In the reading by Roger earlier, the English hymn writer Brian Wren makes it clear that peace is not easy. If peace is about ignoring the human needs around us, hunger, fear, inequality, injustice, oppression, then say no to peace, to that kind of peace. If peace is about turning a blind eye to environmental damage, to the needs of the planet, to the build-up of weapons of destruction, say no. The theme of this year's United Nations Day of Peace was Actions for Peace. It focused on the global sustainable development goals that the UN has been promoting since 2015. An end to poverty, equality, climate action, quality education, and many others. Of such is the journey of peace. And what about peace education? Now some 40 years since I was initially charged with that rather challenging title. Some people are still using that terminology, not so much here in Northern Ireland, but certainly in some developing countries. But while the term may have been largely set aside here, the concept, I think, has taken root. Since those earlier days of limited understanding, there have been many educational initiatives that have helped persuade teachers of the importance of building strong cross-community relationships, of developing positive awareness of local and global diversity, of building trust, of learning how to discuss controversial or sensitive issues. And it's probably important to say that I believe we need these kinds of processes no less in our churches and in many other institutions in society, just as we need them in our schools. Much of this work in education started with voluntary organisations, groups like Corrimila, Community Relations in Schools, Speedwell Project, and quite a few others, and was gradually taken increasingly seriously by the official education authorities. And now we have programs like shared education, bringing children and young people together from our still largely separate schooling systems. And this has been supported since 2016 by a Shared Education Act. It's also there, actually, in the Northern Ireland curriculum, what teachers do with their classes, particularly through areas such as personal development and mutual understanding in primary schools, and local and global citizenship in post-primary schools. One of my personal passions has been the desire to see religious education in schools take much more seriously its potential for helping children and young people to gain a critical understanding of religious ideas and diversity, rather than simply trying to reinforce a conservative Christian narrative, as still happens all too often. Alongside all this, of course, has been the growth of integrated schooling, with some excellent work in integrated school classrooms, though the numbers are still relatively small. Teacher education now also gives much more time to these concerns than it did in the past. But these developments are positive, and I believe they represent the essence of what we were trying to do those years ago in peace education. But we do need more. And we need parents and grandparents and members of the community generally to support and encourage schools and teachers in their role of helping to build a peaceful and shared society. UNESCO defined a significant element of education with two terms: learning to live together and learning to be. And for me, this is right at the heart of what I understand education and peace to to be all about. My 11 years in peace education shaped me and gave me a new professional direction, and it has, I think, remained central to what I've tried to do since then. Yet we don't need a role or a title like that in order to be the peacemakers of which Jesus spoke. We shouldn't need an annual day of peace, whichever month it turns out to be in, to focus us on the everyday task of building a peaceful world. Whether it's in education or in any other walk of life, peace is how we live together. Peace between neighbours, peace between strangers, between creeds, between nations, peace in all things. Peace is not a static end state. It's what we do. Peace is a verb. As the singer-songwriter Tom Paxton wrote, "Peace will come. Let it begin with me."